Hello, everybody. A couple of years ago, well, not that many years ago, so to speak, at that I wrote a book. I originally published for free as a PDF file on my own my own blog post, but sadly the blog post taken down. I originally read them during este right before Hurricane Maria came in, because I didn't have any internet, electricity, or anything, so I started writing my own personal thoughts on topics of religion and politics. I had my own philosophical journey and stuff like that, and I'm going to republish it somewhere in the comment section on the post. So trying to figure out how I gotta do that, but for the most part, yeah. And I already did like a text to speech audiobook like 2 years ago, I think it was, on this channel as well, so you can listen to it, even though it's text to speech, like robotic audio. Este, yeah. So basically, this part of the video is basically me a little bit adding extra stuff that I didn't wrote down because I already finished it. And this is like more of a like more stuff that I learned throughout time. Yeah, like studying, these types of topics. Este, like a good example would be like Eastern Orthodox Christianity. When people make critiques against Christianity, it's mainly to Roman Catholicism and the Protestant movement, right? Even though Eastern Orthodox has its own shared history of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, extermination of indigenous people, especially in Siberia, many cases where the Eastern Orthodox Church joined forces with the fascist regimes in Greece and Romania, like the Iron Guard, who combines Eastern Orthodox mysticism with with fascism. And people forget that Eastern Orthodox were highly enthusiastic supporters of the Nazi regime, participating participating in the Holocaust. And anti-LGBT sentiment is extremely strong. Near the current Eastern Orthodox Russian Church considered the war against Ukraine as a holy war. The mass systematic extermination of Muslims in Bosnia and also systematic rape against Bosnian women to quote unquote cleanse the impurity of the people, and give blessings to these horrific people who committed such terrible acts, these crimes against humanity and war crimes, right? Just like the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, a long history of pedophilic behavior among the priests, domestic abuse against women, especially their spouses if they're married, you know, and shit like that. That people often overlook throughout the history of Eastern Orthodoxy. And even in Russia, where they consider themselves the third Rome, right? And consider themselves as the rightful rulers of Europe and some parts of Asia where Russia controls. As like we have horrific tyrants, Ivan the Terrible, right? And then Nicholas II with Bloody Sunday. And other horrible events they have throughout history, justification for Eastern Orthodox theology, political theology all the time. Besides that, other religions are not immune to this. For example, Buddhism, even though among religious anarchists, if they are all like theistic or non-theistic major religions, Buddhists tend to have a reputation to be the most compatible with anarchism and to a lesser extent atheism. And to be more specific, Zen Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism. Even though this is not really true, because even though they consider themselves non-theistic, they do not reject gods outright. Zen Buddhists and Pure Land Buddhists do believe in gods. It's not much of a priority compared to other schools of thought, right? And even then, try to point examples of anarchism within Buddhist history, and there isn't. The Buddha himself was a hierarchical figure, established hierarchy within him, to consider himself as a legit movement has to establish a hierarchical centralized system to perceive the rest of North India that it was a legit movement. Despite the fact that it was a reformist Hindu movement who just reject the authority of the Vedas and the priest kings, who just combine the elements of Hinduism with the non-theistic elements of Jainism and other similar schools of thought that sit around the same time, combined with the native Nepal folk religions like the snake imagery and the lotus flower originate in the shamanic religions of that area. It's not a Buddhist invention. You know, it's the even then it has its own history, of imperialism, colonialism, extermination of indigenous people throughout the world. Look, Sri Lanka is a great example where we have stories of early Buddhist rulers being assisted by the gods for their conquests, annihilating the opposition forces. Then, you know, the same thing goes happen to in Japan, where many Buddhist anarchists will point to the peasant kingdom. In Japan during medieval Japan as an example of it, based on Pure Land tradition. Even though they develop an aristocracy, a military state, pretty much, where warriors, like samurai warriors and warrior monks, were the rulers of the area. So even though it was better society compared to the rest of Japan overall, it was, at the end of the day, a hierarchical, centralized, and sometimes oppressive if you didn't subscribe to this particular branch of Pure Land, because there were multiple schools of Pure Land Buddhism. True Pure Land would be the most anarchistic of the bunch, like Shen Ra is one example who was an influential figure. I highly recommend an academic peer-reviewed paper called, Libertarian Like Zen, it's the libertarian reading of Shen Ra, and then you can read it from the academic book Religious Anarchism. If there are no perspective, I highly recommend it. If the Yeah, it's the same thing. Fascism and Buddhism had a strong connection. Even before fascism was really a thing in Japan, so to speak, like their war against Russia and the early wars against China before World War II were heavily influenced and promoted by Buddhists who if they did their own fascist coup attempts in Japan. If they like the League of Blood incident, for example, and multiple civil events that happened, where they justify that if the Buddhists should be spread by the sword. Este, and they believe the Emperor Hirohito was the future Buddha or the philosopher king, depending which Buddhist doctrine you subscribe to. And some Tibetan Buddhists, for example, believe Nicholas II was a reincarnated goddess, or in Mongolia, where they combine Tibetan Buddhism with Stalinism to oppress people. I recommend the book Red Shambhala, the example, where right before Stalin takeover, early years of this socialist Marxist state, it was a theocratic Tibetan Buddhist state where they kick out any lay followers. It was basically an elitist society controlled by it. The same thing with the like Tibetan Buddhism, which is by far the most esoteric, mystical, occult school of thought within Buddhism, right? Even though like esoteric traditions of Buddhism was later addition. I already did a video about my problems with Buddhist mysticism in general, where the only Nagoyaga, who's often considered as the second Buddha, the most influential this person in Buddhism besides the Buddha himself, basically the one who actually started this esoteric mystical occult tradition. Before that wasn't really much of a thing, with some stories about some Buddhists having psychic powers, some doing miracles like levitation and walking on water, some healing miracles, and that's about it. And only the Virakura, which is like a cosmic Buddha, but that's about it. They didn't much of a tradition about that before that point. Even then, Tibetan Buddhism has supported tyrannical regimes throughout history, especially in China. At for multiple examples, I gotta put in the description what kingdoms have tried to, where it was the official state religion, and it was like I said, like all empires, it is a heavily oppressive system where slavery, colonial, imperial injustice was basically the the law and order of the time. And you have to be careful with that, because no matter how revolutionary you can be, religious or irreligious or anti-religious even, the moment you subscribe to some form of hierarchical structure, it becomes a right-wing perversion of it. Marxism is a great example of this, especially the Leninist variety. I will talk about that later. Este, that we have to understand this. Even then, like I said about Japan, multiple examples of these cases about the oppressor, like the samurai, who often been romanticized these warriors with honor, like just like how in Europe with the medieval knights had this succession, but in reality they were just a bunch of dogs and gangs, criminals who you were allowed to do crimes because of their privileged status, and they only care about wealth and power, not much. And another area learn about early history of Islam, that it was originally a pan-Abrahamic, semi-universalist movement where Christians, Jews, and Muslims were basically a single movement, and Islam as its own distinct religion didn't start really until like places like Iraq and Syria, if like during the Second Caliphate, if the where they joined forces. A good example by the scholars in the book in the chapter "The Founding Constellation of the Community in Medina." If the Christians accepted the Quran revelation during Muhammad's movement, but and regardless of Christian polemic presenting the Quran's message, one could one could even suggest that it was more difficult for Jews to accept the Quranic Jesus than for the Christians. But during the movement, the Jews did. As the Quranic evidence, as the Constitution suggests, it must be remembered that Jesus is more rarely mentioned than, for instance, Moses or other patriarchs. Hence, it appears that relatively few occurrences of Jesus the Messiah in the Quran revelation did not tether some Jews from joining the community of believers. And in Islam, for example, there's been instances of influences of other cultures. Like, for example, like if I'm not mistaken, almost half of the vocabulary in Islam is outside of Arabic, like Coptic, Ethiopian, Aramaic, Hebrew, etc. In fact, Islam, to a lesser extent in certain communities in its early years, was a non-conformist offshoot of Manichaeanism, and we see evidence of making influence way later in Islamic history, like Mastak. While Islam itself is basically a mix of multiple Christian influences of Syrian Christianity, as the nursed Gnostic ideas like Docetism, Monocyphism, este, like to lesser the Arianism, like Joannian influence, the Paraclete. In fact, the idea that Muhammad was a prophet, was not new. 400 years before that, the second century Christian prophet Montanus and the Montanist movement had basically similar ideas, who thanked themselves as a paraclete of the community of believers. And we see they were heavily influenced from the second century gospel hymn by Tatian called the Tesaron, using many influences in the Quran, and possibly many of the like secret unknown letters made are very likely to be like the Eastern Syria Christian hymns and the Eucharist and liturgy, and even the Islamic version of Heaven and Paradise were inspired heavily by the great Syrian church hymnologist Ephraim Cyrus of Nicaea in the 4th century, and his hymns of paradise. If you compare his hymns of paradise to the Quranic depiction of heaven, are very, very similar. Another influence we see from Islam, to a Christian influence in Islam and Muhammad himself, was the famous text called Liber Gratum, written by Jacob of Sarog. Like even early Muslims believed that the primordial language eh, in the world was Syriac, or the Syrian language. In fact, the famous Dome of the Rock, the prior architectural model for Ab Malik and his construction, was literally copy paste from the Katishma Mosque, which is an Eastern Orthodox temple in the same area. Even like if I'm not mistaken, like an hour or 2 hours walk away from the Dome of the Rock. In fact, in that church of Katishma, that's where you can see the eerie similarities between Jesus' nativity in that and the Quranic story of Jesus' nativity. And the nativity story of Jesus in the Quran is based of a Christian text, the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew, and to the lesser extent, the Evangelion of James. And we have archaeological and linguistic evidence that the language of the Quran is based on Syro-Palestinian Arabo-Semitic dialect. and we have two actually contemporary sources for that. The Arabia Felix and the Deserta. And also, I learned more about Puerto Rican history that between 1811 and 1810, like a 1 year, 2 year period, Puerto Rico was technically independent because of the San Rehan Mission was the only area where they have pro-independence politicians during the Spanish rule, and they kind of succeed with the post Puerto Rican bishop controlled the treasury and basically hostage the government. And also, like I said later about Marxists betraying the revolution that happened so many times that it's kind of ridiculous. Where, in Kerala, where the most libertarian variety of Marxism, which is basically almost on a decentralized approach, has secret police to persecute Muslims in the area. And historically speaking, Marxist-Leninists killing Trotskyists, even though Trotsky are trying to do their own revolt. And even we go to the most left-wing variety of Marxism, like just shy away from anarchism, like the autonomous Marxism, and they're basically kind of useless intellectual elitists, or the situationists, for example, during the May 68 revolt in France, who wanted to take over the area, and in some cases, they even sabotaged the movement where they joined forces with the bourgeois government to stop the protests in order to do their biddings, or Marxists trying to control the usually a decentralized non-hierarchical movement. Trotsky like the JCC turned people back into the left court in France. Groups like the United Socialist Party blocked the taking of the Ministry of Finance and Justice. The Communist Party in French, as they joined forces with the government and the capitalist forces to grab a series of reforms, and turn the factories to the bourgeois and the people. Or in Spain, with the revolutionaries betraying Marxists betraying the anarchists in May Day of all places, the same thing they betrayed the Ukrainians in the Ukrainian Free Territory, the same thing happened in Ukraine, etc. And basically every urban guerrilla group in the 70s and early 80s were basically terrorist organizations sabotaging themselves a lot of the time. The Japanese Red Army, where half of the members were killed by their own groups, or Socialist Irish Republican Army, who were sectarian infighting against the more traditional nationalist Provisional Irish Republican Army. It was basically a civil war within a civil war. Or another example would be in Puerto Rico, although it was less of an infighting compared to other places, the Macheteros, they were infighting among themselves. It split into three groups called the Macheteros. One for purely like symbolic protest, the other for purely militaristic approach, like the original founder of Liberto Hera Rios, etc. Or the Orthodox Marxists, like the German Social Democrat Party, who joined forces with basically the proto-fascists to stop the German Communist Revolution from happening in the first place, betraying the revolution as the clearest example of it. Or in Hungary, during the 1956 revolution, was the only time in history where anarchists successfully overthrew a Marxist state, and it was an anarchist revolution society for 2 months. And the Soviet Union failed to invade against it the first time. It was until the second time, with a combined effort of other people within between the revolution, that it led to massacres, mass arrests, deportation, and people hiding in exile. Or the Greek Communist Party, killing hundreds of anarchists in 1944. Also, or in France, like I mentioned earlier, the anarchists and libertarians, like social Algeria strike weight that led to two terrible forms in France being occupied. The Marxist-led CGT union eventually joined it and criticized and authorized millions of their members to strike when they called off the revolution. Este, or in Spain, where under the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, they funded a terrorist death squad to stop the Basque independence movement called the GAL, or the Grupo Antiterrorista de Liberación, or the Anti-Terrorist Liberation Group, illegally established by the socialist government under the Socialist Workers' Party. And all the atrocities that Stalin Mao did, already Lenin and Trotsky already did it. They were the precursors. The only difference between the two, they were doing it within. They wanted to do it within the party, while Stalin wanted to do it both within and outside the party. or Gaddafi funding terrorist left-wing organization that hindered the cause of any revolutionary sentiment throughout the world. There's a great video I put in the description as well. So yeah, like all these things I learned from history and learning history, philosophy, science, physics, etc. that should be aware of, and we need to learn more about these things to understand, given our current climate of global fascism at the moment. So yeah, that's what I had to say. It's basically a quick update video about the stuff. So I hope see you guys next time, and I try my best how to put in the description these things. So good luck.